Hi there, I'm Jim Zirin. Welcome back to more Conversations in the Digital Age. To say that 2016 was a year of unanticipated outcomes would be a gross understatement. In February, Justice Scalia died suddenly, creating the longest vacancy in history on the Supreme Court. In England, a populist referendum mandated Britain's exit from the European Union. The election result led to the resignation of the Prime Minister, David Cameron. The Chicago Cubs won the World Series. And in Italy, Prime Minister Matteo Renzi resigned after he put forward a deeply flawed constitutional referendum, resulting in a political crash. In South Korea, President Park, the country's first female leader, was impeached and suspended from office amid dark allegations she had leaked classified information. And of course, here in America, Donald Trump, an outsider, performed the political feat no one thought possible, emerging victorious over 14 professional politicians in the Republican primary and then narrowly defeating Hillary Clinton to become the 45th president of the United States. How did Trump win the election? Where did Hillary Clinton let down her guard? Did Trump land a lucky punch? How did he tap into the discontent of a polarized nation? Here to tell what accounted for Trump's stunning upset victory is a distinguished political commentator and pollster, Doug Schoen. Ever with his finger on the pulse of the public mood, Doug Schoen, welcome.
Jim, thank you for that kind introduction.
Now, this was the year of unanticipated outcomes. Machiavelli thought politics was the art of the possible. Maybe this year was the art of the unanticipated. What's your assessment of what happened?
Well, my sense is that there are a couple of factors. First, this, as you suggested, is a deeply polarized, deeply angry electorate, and it's angry first and foremost with Washington, with political insiders, politics, as usual. Second, after 8 years of President Obama, there was a desire for a different approach, different policies. And third, Hillary Clinton was a deeply flawed candidate, and combined with Donald Trump tapping into the sentiments that were anti-Washington, anti-incumbent, pro-change, we got a result that few, as you suggested, thought was possible.
Now, a number of people, including Paul Krugman on the left, have suggested that the election was somehow tainted, first by the Comey announcement coming 10 days before the election, which was later basically retracted, and second, by the Russian hack. How do you see these factors as influencing the election?
Well, a couple of points. First of all, I think if Comey tainted the election, as Secretary Clinton and her supporters have said, he certainly resuscitated a candidacy for the Secretary of State that may well have been hanging in the balance when he said that she had not been truthful, but cleared her of any illegalities back in, I think it was July. So hard to say, but when Comey made his first, or I dare say second statement about Secretary Clinton in the waning days of the campaign, she was already sinking and the desire for change was strong. So while Comey didn't help Hillary, I don't think it was the decisive or determinative factor.
On October 31st, which was the day after the Comey statement, you said you couldn't vote for Hillary.
I did.
Because you thought that if she were elected, it would provoke a constitutional crisis.
I did say
with
that.
all the investigations and prosecutions and everything else.
I did.
Did you change your mind after Comey's statement on the day before the election?
No, I didn't change my mind because to me there were too many unanswered questions. The fact that he had been able to review hundreds of thousands of emails apparently using search techniques or some other automated technique still left me with questions. But the more serious concern that I had was we had a flawed candidate who had engaged in practices that I thought had really, for others, created grave legal peril. And I just thought with that, the Clinton Foundation and the like, it was time for me to say, I can't do this. I philosophically disagreed with Trump on a number of issues, still do, particularly Russia. And so I was left, as many Americans were, unable to support either candidate.
Now, what about the Russian hack? 4 senators have called for a bipartisan investigation, including Senator McCain. Trump says there's nothing to it. Should there be an investigation? And are you outraged by the Russian hack?
Well, I think it's consistent with a pattern of behavior by the Russians. I've written a book called Putin's Master Plan, wrote another book called the Russia-China Axis about how they've teamed up against the United States. So I think it's consistent with what they've done around the world. I wouldn't call myself so much outraged as I am concerned about the Russians and their policies and what we do.
Trump seems to have surrounded himself with a number of Putinistas. He expressed his admiration for Putin. General Flynn is a great admirer of Putin. If Manafort comes back in, he's someone...
I don't think Manafort's going to
come back. You don't think he'll come back in, but he may be a gray eminence behind the scenes.
He could be, I guess.
He certainly will know Trump's private phone number, and he certainly is very sympathetic to the Russians. Right. Tillerson at State is someone who's had close dealings with President Putin. Are you disturbed by all these Putinistas around
certainly
Trump?
Disturbed by what they've done in Ukraine, their threats to the Baltics, the role they've played in dividing Europe, and of course their role in Syria. I'm worried about all of it.
But isn't there another way of looking at it, that it's high time for a reset with Russia, that the relationship has been unduly antagonistic? We need them in Syria. We need them in the Middle East. They may help us with China. And is there any reason why we shouldn't try to have some element of détente with them?
Well, we sort of tried that in the Obama administration. I don't think it worked so well.
Well, Trump's strong suit, he says, is that he can make a deal better than anybody else.
Well, I think he probably can make a deal, but I suspect if he does, it'll be on the Russians' terms. And if we make a deal on the Russians' terms and allow them to keep Crimea and part of eastern Ukraine, potentially allow incursions into the Baltics, restrict what we do in terms of the rapid reaction force and the missile shield in Russia, and allow them to ratify indefinitely the rule of Bashar Assad in Syria, I think that's a pretty rotten deal. I believe he could make that deal, but I don't think that helps the world.
Let's get back to the election.
Sure.
The black vote was said to be down 8% nationally over the last presidential election. Blacks presumably would have been more sympathetic to Hillary than to Donald Trump. What accounts for their taking a powder on the election?
The absence of Barack Obama on the ballot. The mistake Hillary Clinton and her supporters made was to assume they could reassemble the Obama coalition. That was a unique coalition for a unique political personality. And I think that the Democrats, having lost touch with the white working class, ultimately gave Trump an opening he was able to exploit.
Let's examine that a little bit.
Sure.
It has been suggested that there was a certain amount of electoral nihilism among the black community because they felt Obama had failed to deliver on his promises, as had Bill Clinton when he was president. Do you think it was that, or was it voter suppression?
I think it was
neither.
Was it just
the lack of Obama on the ticket?
Enthusiasm for Secretary Clinton? I just think turnout was down because there was a lack of enthusiasm for her that ultimately probably cost her the election.
The black vote probably put her over in the primaries against Bernie Sanders.
It did.
But not there in the general election.
Not enough votes there to overcome the real movement among the white working class to Donald Trump in the last couple of weeks.
Now, let's look at the gender issue. Exit polls show 54% of women who voted in favor of Hillary, as opposed to 41% for Trump.
Right.
And with men, it was almost the opposite result. But there were still many college-educated women who either came home to the Republican Party or found themselves voting for Trump, the polls showed. I mean, what accounts for this in light of the tape and Trump's comments about women and,
I
and
think
the rest.
we in New York have this view that our views of gender and gender bias and sexual harassment,
Reproductive rights.
reproductive rights have the same resonance throughout the country. And clearly the exit polls suggest to me that that may not be the case. There was a gender gap, but not as big as some of the pundits had predicted.
Now, what about the Latino vote? The Latinos certainly felt insulted by Trump's comments about the wall and his comments about immigration. And yet the Latino vote really did not come out heavily for Hillary, and in many cases came out for Trump.
Yeah, I think, again, legal Hispanic immigrants would necessarily find something, not a lot, but something about Trump's pitch that they found acceptable. There are conservative Cubans who might well have voted against the deal with Cuba. And so I'm not totally surprised. But again, the media decided that it was going to be a monolithic Hispanic vote that certainly didn't show up.
Doug, let's take 4 key states
Sure.
that Obama won in 2004, 2008, and which Hillary,
Sure.
I should say 2008, 2012, and which Hillary thought she had to win
Right.
in order to win the election, thought she would win. So we have Florida, Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania. Now, although Obama took these states in 2008 when he first ran, he took them by slimmer margins in 2012. So they should have seen a trend
Sure.
toward the Republicans in these key areas and analyzed why that was so.
Sure, yep.
Why didn't their strategy work, and how did she fall down in states like Michigan that
Well, a couple of things.
have been so traditionally Democratic?
Ohio, certainly, and Florida always are in play, always are in swing states. She should have assumed, for the sake of argument, that she was going to potentially lose them both, as she did. That being said, your question then becomes very relevant, Jim, because she should have had a firewall in Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and Michigan. Given Trump's appeal to the white working class, given the presence in large numbers of non-college educated white working class voters in those 3 states, she did not ever go to Wisconsin, had a minimal presence in Michigan, did campaign hard in Pennsylvania, but her appeal was largely to her base, and she was unable to extend her constituency, and hence she lost, I think, the 3 states by a combination of less than 100,000 votes. A statistical anomaly, to be sure, but one she could have prevented, with a more prescient and proactive campaign strategy.
Well, you look at Pennsylvania, where down-ballot candidates for governor, state treasurer, who were Democrats, prevailed in the election.
Right.
Even though the Republicans in the Senate race, where it was a Democratic female challenger, Katie McGinty, and in the presidential race, even though they lost. I mean, how do you account for that? Do you see a Democratic voter going into the polling place and voting for Trump, and yet voting for Pat Toomey for senator, and voting for Democrats further down the line?
I think that did happen, Jim. I think there's a lot of evidence in state after state there were more votes for down ballot races than for the top of the ticket. I think there was a lack of enthusiasm for Hillary, but beyond the lack of enthusiasm, there was also a sense of outrage in these constituencies we've been talking about, white working class voters, where there was a lot of support for Trump, basically to send a message to Washington, to Obama, to the Clintons, that it was time for a change.
And what accounts for the swing, do you think, in these pivotal states from states like Michigan that were so heavily Democratic, always have been? I mean, even when Mitt Romney ran in 2012, the son of the former governor of Michigan, Obama still won overwhelmingly.
Well, I think that the Democratic campaign, which was pitched largely at progressives, it was pitched at blacks, Hispanics, the LGBT community really didn't talk to working class or mainstream middle class, middle American voters who were, the so-called Reagan Democrats. And I think we saw more defections, more than the Clinton campaign expected, but candidly, they weren't ready for it.
What really could Hillary have done? I mean, Hillary's campaign, the message was basically, I'm not Trump. Trump is terrible, and I'm going to save you from the apocalypse.
Right, and
that was not coupled with any message as to what she was going to do,
Precisely.
particularly in the area of the economy. Now, what could she have done?
Well, there's a simple answer: jobs. That is, some notion of economic revitalization. Her message largely had to do with fairness, with redistribution. And you can support fairness and believe that, the wealthy in New York, on Wall Street, are making too much money, but it doesn't put money in your pocket changing the tax system to tax the wealthy more. What you need to do is create jobs, create opportunity, and make it clear to people you understand their concerns. And the working class Reagan Democrats are not sitting around worrying about jiggling with the tax code. They're worrying about making ends meet, and Hillary didn't really speak to that.
You think she should have talked a little bit about plant closings? It's rather easy to close a plant in the United States and move it to another state or move it to a foreign country. I think it only requires 30 days or 60 days notice, while in Europe, you have to take account of the social costs. You have to pay money to take care of the workers, and you're assessed. It's much more difficult to close a plant and terminate people's jobs.
I think you're absolutely right. And there was no sense that she was speaking for working people. She was speaking against outsourcing and against moving overseas. But there was no sense that she identified with the life experience and the challenges, particularly wage stagnation, that working class voters are facing. And I didn't hear anything from her where she appeared to recognize how people live on a day-to-day basis.
Well, Trump took another tack. He blamed the loss of jobs on immigration,
right?
On undocumented workers from Mexico, on NAFTA, on trade agreements rather than trade, and very little about the technological dislocation from technology and automation. So his campaign was not really truth-based, because we know that there is relatively little loss of jobs from immigration from period, and immigration from Mexico, et cetera, et cetera. So, how did that play out?
I think he hit an emotional chord, whether it be about trade or immigration, where those self-same working class Democrats felt that at least he understood their concerns. And I think with things subsequent to his election, like the carrier deal, talking to Boeing about cost overruns in Air Force One, he was speaking to the kind of lunch pail issues and concerns that voters have. So I think even though he's a New York billionaire, he was more in touch with people's real world concerns than the Secretary of State.
Well, the Boeing issue is an interesting issue because, of course, one of Boeing's great markets is China, and very worried that they'll lose contracts to Airbus, European aircraft manufacturer. And state of Washington, where Boeing is, went decisively for Hillary, and mainly because Boeing workers were concerned they'd lose jobs if Trump took a tough line on China.
Probably a fair concern. I think really what we're seeing with Trump is him on a case-by-case basis trying to put his America First agenda, as he called it, into place. And again, I think particularly at this point, it's had some resonance.
Now, do you think Trump's approval rating among Americans has improved since the election?
I think it has improved. I think any president-elect will see a honeymoon. The real question is 6 months after Inauguration Day, whether it'll be the same. Time will tell.
And what do you think the hot button issues will be? I mean, do you think they're going to give him a lot of trouble on his cabinet appointments?
I think potentially they could on Health and Human Services, certainly the environment, maybe even Secretary of State. But I think what we're going to see is an infrastructure program that'll probably be bipartisan, financed by the issuance of bonds, tax reform, a repatriation of capital overseas, lowering the highest marginal rate to 33%. I think we'll see those policies implemented pretty quickly.
And how are you going to finance the stimulus investment in infrastructure?
That's the
with tax cuts.
I was going to say that's not the $1 million, it's not the $1 trillion, and not the $1 billion. It's the $1 trillion question. So I don't really think we know. It's certainly not going to be higher taxes.
You look at these cabinet appointments. I mean, the appointee for Health and Human Services is for privatizing the whole healthcare system, right, and Social Security. The nominee for Secretary of Labor wants to abolish the minimum wage. You basically have people, the nominee for environmental protection wants to abolish the agency. I mean, it really seems to be an iconoclastic cabinet.
Well, it remains to be seen how much of these initiatives they can actually do. That being said, Trump is keeping his promise to the conservatives to put forward a cabinet that is largely right-wing. Again, I don't think Trump, as a populist, will go along with all this.
And what about the Supreme Court? Do you think he's going to nominate someone who automatically will vote to overrule Roe v. Wade? I mean, Roe v. Wade is really under severe attack now.
I would bet much more likely yes than no.
And can that person get the vote of 60 senators?
I think that's going to be very, very tough.
So I guess there's a question that having lost the popular vote by close to 3 million votes, is Donald Trump going to be able to govern?
Well, I think he's going to need Chuck Schumer and the Democrats, particularly for the infrastructure program and even his tax plan as well. I think he needs the Democrats much more than he might imagine at this point, given both the numbers and also public opinion. He lost the popular vote. And I don't say that to say sour grapes about the election, but just to face facts that he is the president of a divided nation with a narrow electoral college victory and a quite considerable deficit in the popular vote.
Well, you just put your finger on one of the most disturbing aspects of the election, and that's how polarized we are as a nation. We are polarized in our think tanks, we're polarized in our media, we're polarized in the Supreme Court, and we're polarized in Congress. Now, how can we pull together and be a force in the world when we're so bitterly divided ourselves?
Jim, I couldn't agree more. Our weakness at home presages a weakness overseas, and that's why it's so important for Donald Trump to govern based on building consensus across the board, not just governing as a populist conservative.
And do you see him being able to govern and being able to do that?
I hope so. I think one of the things that's missing in our dialogue now is support for a newly elected president, because regardless of our views, we are all Americans, and I think we rise and fall together.
Well, what about, we do rise and fall together, but the bedrock is our Constitution, and Trump has been outspoken even after his election in advocating so many positions that are at odds with basic constitutional values, like prosecuting flag burners and stripping them of their citizenship. If he persists in taking that line, he certainly ought to get a great deal of pushback from many elements of society.
Look, I don't think Donald Trump is going to advance or advocate those ideas that come from his early morning Twitter storms. I think that they reflect a unique personality who, based on the circumstances we discussed earlier, was able to take advantage. But I believe and hope and expect the president-elect will respect the Constitution and hopefully build a broad consensus.
And that would include divesting himself of holdings that would present a conflict of interest or violate the emoluments clause of the Constitution?
he suggests himself, he has a different reading of the Constitution that says that a president can't have conflicts of interest. So I would hope he would divest himself, but I think that it's more likely he will absent himself from his business, have his children run it, and maintain that he is not part of a commercial endeavor.
Well, do you think that's a sufficient independence and equivalent to a blind trust?
If he asked me, I would suggest he bring in independent managers and separate himself and his family from the day-to-day operations.
Well, I hope he asks you. Well, getting back to the election,
Yeah.
I have a question for you.
Sure.
Do you think Trump really won the election, or do you think Hillary lost the election?
Oh, I think Donald Trump was elected in spite of himself, not entirely because of himself. I think Hillary lost the election. I think it was not a well-run campaign. I think that there were deep-seated negatives towards her and certainly towards Obama's agenda, and Trump exploited it. But if she had not been as weak as she was, I do not think he would have succeeded.
Hillary was weak. Well, Doug Schoen, I'm afraid we've run out of time, but this has been just marvelous. So thank you so much,
Jim,
for coming
thank you.
by.
I appreciate it.
And thank you for coming by. Tune in next week for more conversations in the digital age. I'm Jim Zirin. All the best and take care.